Hi, I'm Mina.
And I'm Yules.
Thanks for tuning in to Artificially Informed.
Right now, beneath the permanent ice of this completely isolated freezing lake in Antarctica, there is a microbial time capsule that is just actively breathing oxygen.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And at the exact same time, like 11,000 light years away, two massive planets are currently colliding, just grinding each other into a cloud of glowing dust.
Right.
It sounds like, the opening montage to a science fiction film, but this is just today's reality. When you actually sit down and read the reports coming in from around the globe, you realize we are living in a landscape that is deeply, fundamentally interconnected.
Totally.
It's messy, it's incredibly complex, and honestly, trying to figure out what actually matters can feel completely overwhelming.
It is an absolute cascade of data. I mean, we are flooded with updates every minute, and the natural human instinct is to just compartmentalize it.
Yeah, put it in little boxes.
Exactly. We want to put space exploration in one box, artificial intelligence in another, and then global resource conflicts in a third. But those boxes do not actually exist.
Which is exactly why we are here. Welcome to the deep dive. We are so thrilled to have you with us today.
We really are.
Our mission for you, as you listen today, is to take a massive stack of reporting from outlets like the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, obviously, as well as space.com, the BBC, Al Jazeera, Science Daily, and Climate Change News, and truly synthesize it.
Right, connecting the dots.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We want to give you a shortcut to being incredibly well-informed without the fatigue of information overload. Today's journey is going to take you from the absolute furthest reaches of the cosmos down into the microscopic rules that govern our biology and the algorithms of artificial intelligence.
And then finally, right into the fierce geopolitical battles over the resources that are powering our daily lives.
Because the technological leaps we are making in orbit are directly dictating the resource wars happening on the ground, right?
Yeah, you cannot understand this scramble for battery materials in Africa without understanding the data centers being built in America or the rockets being launched in Texas. It is all one massive breathing system.
I was going through the space reporting this morning, and it really feels like we have to start by zooming all the way out.
Let's do it.
To understand our constraints here on Earth, we first need to look at the vast mechanics of the universe, and specifically our physical attempts to navigate it. So NASA, Space.com, and CNN have all confirmed that the crewed Artemis II mission now has a targeted launch date.
April 1st, 2026.
Yeah, and this came after a unanimous vote in a key risk assessment that officially cleared the way. They fully repaired the Space Launch System rocket, the SLS, which is this monolithic, skyscraper-sized vehicle.
That is massive.
But the detail that really caught my eye is that they actually selected an entirely new upper stage for the rocket to enhance its payload capacity.
Right.
Plus, on the orbital side, Congress is actively pushing to extend the operational lifespan of the International Space Station all the way to 2032.
That is a massive commitment, of both capital and political capital. Maintaining a facility in low Earth orbit for that long requires constant, highly expensive resupply.
It does, but reading about them suddenly swapping out the upper stage of a rocket and doing major repairs on the SLS right before a crewed launch, it honestly feels a bit like rebuilding the engine of a classic car while you are already driving it down the highway.
Huh. I can see why it looks precarious from the outside.
Right. Help me understand the physics and the logic here. Why make such fundamental hardware shifts this close to putting humans on top of it?
Well, the underlying logic of the Artemis architecture is fundamentally different from the Apollo missions of the 1960s.
Okay.
Apollo was a sprint. It was about proving we could get there, plant a flag, and get back safely. Artemis II is about establishing permanent infrastructure. It is pure logistics.
So it's about staying there.
Exactly. The upper stage of a rocket is the section that actually pushes the spacecraft out of Earth's orbit and sets it on a trajectory toward the moon. By swapping it out for a more powerful version, NASA is maximizing the cargo weight they can bring.
Oh, I see.
They're not just testing the Orion crew capsule, They are testing the exact hardware configurations required to eventually haul heavy habitat modules to the lunar surface.
Yeah.
Every component flying on Artemis II is a direct stepping stone for a sustainable presence, and eventually the push to Mars.
And the International Space Station extension ties into that Mars push as well, doesn't it?
Precisely. The ISS is our only permanent microgravity laboratory. If you were going to send humans to Mars, which is a journey that takes roughly 7 to 9 months, one way you need to understand exactly how the human body, degrades in zero gravity.
Because it really does degrade.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Bone density loss, fluid shifts to the brain, heavy radiation exposure. Extending the ISS to 2032 ensures we do not lose our testing ground while the new Lunar Gateway, which will be a space station orbiting the moon, is still being constructed.
The scale of that planning is staggering. But NASA is far from the only player on the board now. According to Space.com, SpaceX is prepping the 12th test of its Starship.
Ship 39.
Yeah, under their V3 program launching from Texas in about 4 weeks. And Elon Musk is claiming this iteration will be the most powerful yet.
It's a massive vehicle.
It really is. And at the exact same time, you have a private startup out in Colorado named Luxaturna that just raised $10 million to develop fully reusable satellites.
Wow.
And on the material science front, researchers are actively developing self-healing materials for future spacecraft that can detect structural damage from micrometeoroids and autonomously repair themselves.
See, that autonomous repair capability is a paradigm shift for deep space travel.
How so?
Well, space is not empty. It is filled with microscopic debris traveling at tens of thousands of miles per hour.
Yeah.
A grain of sand hitting a hull at orbital velocity hits with the kinetic energy of a bullet.
That's terrifying.
Yeah. If your spacecraft can chemically mend those microfractures without human intervention, the lifespan of a mission increases exponentially.
That makes total sense from a survival standpoint. But looking at the broader picture, I have to wonder about the power dynamics here. With private companies like SpaceX owning the launch vehicles and startups like Luxaturna owning the reusable satellite networks, are we essentially watching the monopolization of the cosmos by a handful of billionaires?
It's a huge question.
It feels like we are privatizing the stars before we even have a legal framework for them.
The tension you are describing is really the defining geopolitical dilemma of the modern space age. We are operating under the Outer Space Treaty of 1967.
Which is pretty old.
Right. It was written during the Cold War. It basically says that no nation can claim sovereignty over a celestial body. But it says very little about private corporations mining asteroids or deploying massive satellite constellations.
Because they couldn't even imagine that back then.
Exactly. Now, on one hand, the private sector's efficiency is undeniable. Companies like SpaceX use an iterative, fail-fast engineering model.
Where they just blow things up to see what works.
Yeah, they blow up rockets to find the breaking points, which drives technological evolution at a pace traditional government agencies simply cannot match. And Luxaturna's reusable satellites could fundamentally solve the space debris crisis by preventing dead satellites from cluttering low Earth orbit.
But the trade-off is control.
Yes. When private entities control the primary infrastructure of space, I mean the rockets themselves, the satellite internet constellations that whole nations rely on, they hold immense, unchecked geopolitical power.
That's a scary thought.
We are currently watching governments wrestle with how to regulate an industry that is quite literally operating above the atmospheric borders of any single nation. If a private satellite network decides to deny service over a conflict zone, who holds them accountable?
It is a terrifying legal vacuum. And speaking of vacuums, the literal physics of deep space seem to be breaking the rules we thought we understood.
Oh, the anomalies.
Yeah, outlets like Science Daily and the University of Washington are reporting some incredibly strange things. Let's start with the collision. Astronomers just detected what they are calling a completely bonkers collision between two massive exoplanets.
11,000 light years away.
Right. And they did not see the planets hit. They spotted it because a sun-like star suddenly started flickering in a highly unusual way.
They were observing the transit method in reverse, essentially. Usually, a star dims slightly and predictably when a planet crosses in front of it.
Like an eclipse.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in this case, the star's light was being chaotically obscured by a massive, expanding cloud of glowing dust and debris. They caught the infrared heat signature of two planetary bodies literally grinding each other into gravel.
Wow.
Catching planetary destruction in real time is incredibly rare.
It paints such a violent picture of the universe, but the anomaly that really confused me was a merger they observed between a black hole and a neutron star.
Ah, yes, GW 2001-05.
Right. Before these two massive objects finally collided, astronomers noticed they exhibited this strange, highly oval-shaped orbit. Oh, and also, the James Webb Space Telescope recently found that Jupiter's moons are leaving literal cold footprints in the planet's auroras.
It's a lot of new data all at once.
I look at all this and just think, are the physics textbooks wrong? I mean, how does a black hole and a neutron star end up in an oval orbit?
It is forcing astrophysicists to heavily revise those textbooks, yes.
Yeah.
To understand why that oval orbit is causing such a stir, we have to look at gravitational waves.
Okay.
When two incredibly massive objects like a black hole and a collapsed neutron star orbit each other, they churn the fabric of space-time. They emit gravitational waves, which act like ripples in a pond carrying energy away from the system.
Like they're losing momentum.
Right. As they lose energy, historical physics models dictate that their orbits should circularize. They should spiral inward toward each other on perfectly smooth, circular paths until they merge. An eccentric oval orbit immediately prior to a collision entirely defies that model.
Because it implies they didn't have time to smooth out the orbit.
Exactly. It suggests a chaotic formation environment. It means these two objects likely did not form together as a pair over billions of years.
So they just crashed the party.
Yeah, they might have aggressively captured each other in a dense, crowded star cluster, merging so violently and quickly that the orbit never had a chance to circularize. It shows us that gravitational dynamics in the universe are far more aggressive and unpredictable than our clean mathematical models prefer.
And what about the footprints on Jupiter's auroras?
That is a fascinating study in magnetic connectivity. Jupiter has a magnetic field that is unimaginably powerful. Its moons, like Io and Europa, are actively dragging through that field as they orbit.
So they're interacting with it.
They are not passive rocks. They generate electrical currents that travel down the magnetic field lines and crash into Jupiter's polar atmosphere.
Wow.
That crash creates localized freezing cold spots within the swirling auroras.
So the moons are essentially drawing on the planet with electricity. That is brilliant.
It really is.
But, we are talking about events happening thousands of light years away or out by Jupiter. And my favorite piece of research from this entire segment brings it right back down into the dirt on our own planet.
These zircon crystals.
Yes. Science Daily published a report from researchers at Curtin University in Australia. They discovered that microscopic zircon crystals found in ancient beach sands actively trap krypton gas.
Right.
But the krypton gas is generated by cosmic rays hitting the Earth from deep space.
The intersection of deep-time geology and astrophysics is always humbling. Zircon crystals are essentially nature's most resilient hard drives.
That is the perfect way to phrase it. To think that a grain of sand under your feet at the beach is essentially a cosmic time machine.
It's wild to think about.
When high-energy radiation from supernovae or distant black holes travels across the galaxy and strikes the Earth, it interacts with the trace elements in these tiny crystals, creating krypton. By measuring that trapped gas, scientists can literally read millions of years of Earth's erosion and geological history.
Yeah.
Every time you walk on a beach, you are walking on a physical ledger of the cosmos interacting with our planet.
And that reality, that the extreme, invisible forces of the universe dictate the physical environment here on Earth, is really the perfect bridge to understanding our own biology.
How so?
Because understanding how life manages to exist under the relentless radiation and pressure of space naturally forces us to question how life adapts to extremes here in our own biosphere.
Which brings us to a rather sobering discovery regarding the limits of that adaptation. Science Daily reported on what researchers are now defining as a universal temperature curve that governs all biological life.
All of it.
We are talking about every single organism on the planet. Microbes, plants, mammals, they all share this trait. As the ambient temperature rises, their biological performance improves, but only up to a highly specific optimal point.
And then?
The moment an organism surpasses that optimal temperature threshold, there isn't a gradual decline. It is precipitous. Performance just falls off a cliff.
The mechanical reason for that sudden drop is protein denaturation.
What does that mean exactly?
Well, at a certain heat threshold, the complex proteins that act as the building blocks and engines of living cells literally begin to unfold and lose their shape.
Like melting.
Sort of, yeah. And if a protein loses its shape, it completely loses its function.
I suppose that entirely shatters the somewhat optimistic idea that nature will simply evolve its way out of the climate crisis. I think a lot of people, assume that as the planet warms, animals and plants will just slowly adapt over generations to tolerate the heat.
It does shatter that notion. For a long time, there has been a comfortable, perhaps deeply naive assumption that evolution will effortlessly keep pace with a warming climate.
Right.
This universal temperature curve disproves that. It establishes a hard biological ceiling. You cannot infinitely adapt to an environment that is physically cooking the cellular machinery required for life. Once an ecosystem crosses that threshold, biological function simply breaks down.
It is a terrifyingly hard boundary. But life does manage to find a way to thrive in some of the most punishing, isolated pockets of the planet right up to that boundary.
Like the lake in Antarctica.
Yes. NASA's Earth Observatory published an incredible feature on Lake Untersee. It is located deep in Antarctica. The lake is permanently frozen over, completely isolated from the outside atmosphere. Yet beneath the ice, scientists found these massive conical stromatolites.
And stromatolites are essentially layered communities of microbes. They are some of the oldest forms of life on Earth.
Right, and what makes these specific communities so fascinating is that they are trapping incredibly high levels of dissolved oxygen right underneath the permanent ice cover.
It's amazing.
They are surviving in pitch darkness under immense pressure in freezing water. I was reading the descriptions, and the researchers treat this lake like a biological time capsule.
Because it is.
It functions as a perfect frozen analog for what life might look like if we ever managed to drill through the ice on Jupiter's moon, Europa, or Saturn's moon, Enceladus. It is basically alien biology thriving in our own backyard.
That is exactly why NASA is studying it. When we send a probe to Europa to search for biosignatures, we cannot just guess what those signatures might look like.
We need a baseline.
Exactly. We study the extremes of Earth, the deep-sea hydrothermal vents, the subglacial Antarctic lakes to calibrate our sensors. If microbial life can chemically alter its freezing environment to trap oxygen here, we know precisely what chemical imbalances to look for on an icy moon.
It is incredible how rapidly we are advancing our ability to decode biology, and that same acceleration is happening in human medicine.
The Alzheimer study.
Yes, Science Daily reported on a massive breakthrough regarding Alzheimer's research. Scientists have discovered that they can measure structural changes in 3 specific blood proteins to distinguish between healthy individuals and those with early-stage Alzheimer's disease, and they are doing it with remarkable accuracy.
The clinical and societal implications of this cannot be overstated. Historically, diagnosing Alzheimer's early has been an incredibly arduous process.
Yeah, usually requiring sophisticated neuroimaging.
Like PET scans, which are expensive and scarce, or lumbar punctures.
And for anyone who has not had the misfortune of experiencing one, a lumbar puncture involves a physician inserting a needle directly into the spinal canal to draw cerebrospinal fluid.
It's not pleasant.
It is highly invasive, it can be quite painful, and it requires specialized clinical settings.
Exactly. Replacing that traumatic procedure with a simple, non-invasive blood draw is a paradigm shift in neurology. As the global population ages, Alzheimer's is rapidly becoming one of our most pressing public health crises.
Because there's no cure.
Right. And the blood test scales in a way that spinal taps never could. It allows healthcare systems to proactively screen massive populations during routine checkups. The tragedy of Alzheimer's is that by the time severe cognitive decline is obvious, the neurological damage is largely irreversible. A blood test means patients can be identified and begin therapeutic interventions years earlier.
Which gives them a fighting chance.
Yes, which is the only window when current treatments are actually effective at slowing the disease progression.
It feels like we are finally getting a handle on the mechanics of the human brain. But as we decode the organic mind, our attempts to replicate that intelligence through silicon are hitting some incredibly messy, deeply controversial roadblocks.
The AI frontier.
The artificial intelligence frontier is moving so fast, it is generating intense backlash across multiple sectors. I was looking at reporting from the BBC, TechCrunch, Al Jazeera, and Science Daily, and it is a complete spectrum of automation anxiety.
It's everywhere right now.
Let's look at the commercial side first. The writing assistance platform, Grammarly, was just forced to completely pull a new AI tool they launched. It was designed for author impersonation.
That sounds problematic.
Yeah. The tool would learn a user's writing style and then write text mimicking their voice. They faced immediate, fierce backlash from writers over intellectual property concerns.
Of course.
Meanwhile, Meta has fully integrated AI into Facebook Marketplace, allowing their systems to automatically respond to potential buyers on behalf of human sellers, haggling and answering questions autonomously.
It's the wholesale automation of digital interaction.
But the AI is getting so good at mimicry that human experts are scrambling to figure out how to even test its limits. Science Daily detailed how a group of 1,000 experts from various scientific fields just collaborated to create something called Humanity's Last Exam, or HLE.
It's an intense benchmark.
It is a brutal 2,500 question benchmark test. They had to build this because large language models have basically mastered all previous standardized tests. The
Sure.
bar exam, medical boards, SATs.
The issue with previous benchmarks is that they rely on rote memorization and pattern recognition, which is exactly what a massive neural network is built to do. If a test question exists anywhere on the internet, the model has likely ingested it during training.
So what makes Humanity's Last Exam different? How do you stump an AI that has basically read the entire internet?
You have to ask questions that require novel, multi-step spatial reasoning or deep abstract logic. For example, instead of asking an AI to summarize a historical event, HLE might provide an obscure, highly complex architectural blueprint,
Okay.
and then ask the AI to calculate the structural load failure point of a specific beam if a certain material is swapped out. It requires the AI to synthesize multiple disparate fields of physics, geometry, and material science in a way it has never seen before.
Wow.
It tests actual comprehension over statistical prediction.
That is fascinating. We are having to invent new forms of logic puzzles just to see where the machine breaks. But the stakes of where the machine breaks get infinitely higher when you move from writing emails to guiding weapons.
Yes, the military application.
Al Jazeera is reporting a growing, intense backlash against tech giants, specifically OpenAI, regarding the ethics and legality of integrating their AI systems into military operations and targeting logistics.
It's a massive debate right now.
I look at the Grammarly controversy, where writers are angry about an algorithm mimicking their tone in an email, and then I look at the military using AI to analyze battlefield data. They seem like completely different conversations, but are they?
Not at their core, no.
Are we just building collaborative tools, or are we building black boxes designed to entirely replace human authenticity and human judgment?
They are absolutely the same conversation, just at opposite ends of the consequence spectrum. Whether it is a novelist's voice or a drone's target, the fundamental debate is about accountability and the erosion of human oversight.
The black box problem.
Let's look at the mechanics of a neural network. It is essentially a black box. You feed it millions of data points, whether that is a decade of a writer's published novels or thousands of satellite images of military vehicles. The AI weighs probabilities and spits out an output. But because of the billions of parameters involved, even the engineers who built the AI cannot definitively trace exactly why the model made a specific decision.
It cannot show its math.
Correct. So in the case of Grammarly, writers were outraged because their unique identity, their creative voice, was being ingested and commodified by a black box without their explicit ongoing consent. It removes the human soul from the creative process.
And in the military context.
In the military context, the ethical crisis revolves around removing the human from the chain of command. If a black box algorithm analyzes drone footage and flags a building as a hostile weapons depot, and a commander orders a strike based on that algorithmic assessment, who is responsible if the AI hallucinates?
That is a terrifying scenario.
What if the algorithm misinterpreted the pixel pattern of a hospital? We want tools that enhance our capabilities, but we are structurally terrified of delegating our final agency to systems we cannot audit.
And the physical reality is that these AI systems, whether they are impersonating a poet or calculating artillery trajectories, they do not exist in the ether.
No, they are incredibly physical.
A single query to an advanced AI model uses exponentially more electricity than a standard internet search. These systems run on massive servers inside sprawling data centers, which are hooked up to global power grids.
The cloud is actually just thousands of miles of copper wires, steel, and lithium batteries.
Exactly. The digital world is entirely constrained by physical resources, and that brings us directly into the current fierce global friction over those exact materials.
The resource war.
Yes. The advanced technology we just discussed requires immense amounts of energy and critical minerals. Let's look at the scramble for those resources, as detailed in recent reporting by Climate Change News.
It's getting intense over there.
Over a dozen African nations are currently attempting to overhaul how they export their natural wealth. Zimbabwe is taking a very notable lead in this. They have completely banned the export of raw, unrefined critical minerals, specifically lithium. Their objective is clear. They want to force foreign tech and mining companies to stop simply extracting raw dirt and shipping it overseas. They want those companies to build local processing and refining plants inside Zimbabwe.
It is a strategy of moving up the value chain. Historically, resource-rich nations in the global south act as quarries. They export raw ore at incredibly low margins, while foreign nations refine it, build the batteries, and capture all the economic value.
So they want a piece of the actual tech boom.
Exactly. By banning raw exports, Zimbabwe is attempting to force industrialization within its own borders.
Meanwhile, the United States is officially moving to form what they are calling a critical minerals club to consolidate trading blocs among allied nations.
That sparked quite a debate.
Reading through the analysis on this, you really see two distinct realities being presented depending on the political lens. In Washington, the framing is entirely about national security and supply chain defense.
Yes, from a defense standpoint.
Proponents of this club argue it is an absolutely necessary maneuver to secure vital military and digital components. Currently, China dominates the global refining capacity for critical minerals. If a conflict breaks out, the U.S. and its allies cannot risk being cut off from the materials required to build everything from fighter jets to the very data centers running our AI.
It is viewed as a strategic decoupling to ensure technological independence.
But then you read the reaction from critics globally, particularly those advocating for climate justice and equitable development, and they see this completely differently.
Right.
They strongly argue that this U.S.-led club essentially prioritizes American economic hegemony over a fair global green transition. The argument is that these powerful Western coalitions end up coercing resource-rich nations in the global South to cater to U.S. trade interests.
Which effectively undermines the sovereignty of those nations.
Yes. They argue the West should be helping these nations develop their own refining capabilities unconditionally, rather than strong-arming them into exclusive clubs.
Both perspectives illustrate the incredibly high stakes of the green energy transition. The mechanics of power haven't changed, just the fuel source. But looking closely at Zimbabwe's export ban, the practical reality of executing that strategy is tremendously difficult.
Why is that?
Mining economists point out that banning raw lithium exports might actually backfire without massive foundational investments in Zimbabwe's domestic infrastructure, specifically water and electricity.
Because refining takes power.
Consider the refining process for lithium. Raw spodumene ore, which is what is mined from the ground, is heavy rock. You have to crush it, roast it at extreme temperatures, and treat it with harsh chemicals to extract battery-grade lithium carbonate.
That sounds intense.
That process requires a massive, stable, and continuous supply of electricity.
Which is a huge problem if your national grid experiences rolling blackouts.
Precisely. There is a profound irony here. You need a massive amount of stable energy to run the processing plants that refine the lithium required to build green energy batteries. If the local power grid cannot support the factory, the foreign companies won't build it. The raw mineral simply sits in the ground, local miners lose their jobs, and the entire global supply chain experiences a massive bottleneck.
It is a brutal catch-22. You need the infrastructure to process the minerals to build the infrastructure. And while nations bicker over who gets to refine lithium, the actual physical deadlines to fix the climate are quietly passing us by.
The PAICC meeting.
Yeah, Climate Change News reports that the Paris Agreement Implementations and Compliance Committee, the PAICC, is currently holding an emergency meeting in Bonn, Germany. The reason they are meeting is staggering. 62 different countries have completely missed the deadline to submit their updated climate plans, known as Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs.
Over a year late.
They're over a year late. And we are not just talking about small island nations struggling with administrative overhead. This list includes major global economic powers and heavy emitters like India and Argentina. Collectively, these 62 delinquent nations represent 22% of all global greenhouse gas emissions.
The entire architecture of the Paris Agreement relies on the ratcheting mechanism. The idea that every few years, nations will publicly commit to steeper and steeper emissions cuts.
Right.
If nearly a quarter of the global emissions pool simply stops reporting their data and updating their goals, the mathematical models predicting our climate trajectory fall apart. You cannot manage a crisis if you refuse to measure it.
At the exact same time, in an attempt to push things forward, Colombia and the Netherlands are co-hosting the first conference on the transition away from fossil fuels. But honestly, transitioning away from fossil fuels feels incredibly abstract and distant when you look at the immediate, visceral crisis happening in the Middle East right now regarding oil.
It is a highly volatile situation.
The reporting across the board from the BBC, France 24, RT, the South China Morning Post, Al Jazeera, and CNBC paints a picture of rapid escalation. Let's walk through the mechanics of what is happening on the ground. U.S. President Donald Trump has publicly claimed that Iran is about to surrender.
But the reality on the ground is different.
Very different. The events taking place in the region show an intense, multi-front conflict that is actively expanding. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, has officially called for the Strait of Hormuz to remain closed.
The Strait of Hormuz is arguably the most critical maritime choke point on the planet.
It really is. It is this narrow strip of water between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. Geographically, it is tiny, but it carries roughly 20% of the entire world's global oil supply.
Every single day.
Every day, millions of barrels of crude oil pass through that narrow channel. It is the economic jugular vein of the planet, and right now it is an active conflict zone.
There have been a lot of incidents.
There have been 18 verified attacks on commercial shipping vessels in the region, with 6 of those attacks occurring in just a 48-hour window. On top of that maritime chaos, a U.S. military KC-135 refueling plane recently crashed in Iraq during operations, tragically killing all 4 crew members on board. We are seeing Iranian missiles striking residential areas in northern Israel. Hezbollah, operating out of Lebanon, just fired a record 200 rocket barrage, the largest single barrage of the war so far.
And Israel responded.
Israel has responded forcefully by launching massive, large-scale airstrikes deep into the Lebanese capital of Beirut. And fresh drone strikes have just targeted infrastructure in Dubai.
The market reaction was immediate.
The economic shockwave was instantaneous. The Dow Jones Industrial Average tumbled over 700 points, closing at a new 2026 low of under 47,000. This massive stock sell-off was driven directly by spiking crude oil prices and the sudden resurgence of inflation fears stemming entirely from this conflict.
It's all connected.
Help me connect the dots here. How does a drone strike near a strait in the Middle East instantly erase billions of dollars from a stock market in New York?
It is a masterclass in the fragility of globalized supply chains. When we analyze this from a geopolitical perspective, we have to look at what these strikes are mechanically designed to achieve.
Okay.
These localized military actions, the ship attacks, the rocket barrages, are not just about territorial control or religious ideology. They are explicit economic levers designed to shape foreign policy in Washington and to rattle global markets.
So they're targeting the wallet.
Exactly. When Iran threatens the Strait of Hormuz, they are leveraging their geography to inflict asymmetric warfare. Let's follow a barrel of oil. If commercial ships are being attacked in the Strait, maritime insurance companies immediately skyrocket the premiums they charge to cover those tankers.
Makes sense.
Some shipping companies will simply refuse to enter the Gulf entirely. That creates an instant bottleneck in the global supply of crude oil,
Which drives up the price.
When the supply of oil drops but global demand remains the same, the price per barrel shoots up. That price increase is immediately felt at the gas pump in Ohio, or the manufacturing plant in Germany, or the shipping logistics hub in Tokyo. Higher fuel costs mean it costs more to transport groceries to the supermarket, which drives up the cost of food.
That is inflation.
Precisely. By shutting down that specific waterway, Iran demonstrates to the West that any military action against them carries a massive, immediate financial cost for the entire world.
And the markets panic.
The stock market drop is a reflection of investors realizing that corporate profits are about to be eaten alive by energy costs. It proves that local conflicts are never truly local anymore. The shockwaves travel at the speed of the global market.
And those economic shockwaves from the Middle East, combined with the scramble for critical minerals we just discussed, are fundamentally rewriting the political and economic map of the Americas.
The shifts in the hemisphere are massive.
Which brings us to a fascinating shift in our own hemisphere. Let's look at the massive energy shifts happening right now, as reported by News Americas Now and Latin America reports. The traditional power centers are completely inverting.
Like Guyana.
Yes, Guyana, a relatively small nation on the northern coast of South America, is rapidly emerging as a massive global oil and agricultural powerhouse. The offshore oil discoveries there are so vast that economic experts are now saying Guyana could potentially single-handedly save the CARICOM integration project, the Caribbean community, by providing regional food and energy security to neighboring island nations that have historically relied on imports.
It is an unprecedented economic transformation. A nation that was previously economically marginalized is suddenly becoming the anchor of regional stability.
Conversely, look at a traditional resource heavyweight like Peru. They are currently in a 14-day declared national emergency with severe gas rationing following a massive explosion at the Camisea gas project pipeline.
That's a huge crisis for them.
Taxi drivers in the capital of Lima are waiting in massive hours-long lines just to get fuel to work. And then you look at Cuba. The island is facing extreme systemic blackouts, some lasting nearly 24 hours a day.
The grid failure is devastating.
The power grid failure is so severe that it has sparked rare public protests in major cities like Havana. The humanitarian situation is so dire that the United Nations is actively negotiating with the United States to allow emergency fuel shipments into Cuba, explicitly attempting to bypass the decades-old embargo just to keep hospitals running.
And amidst that crisis, there's an incredibly interesting, high-stakes diplomatic development occurring quietly behind the scenes. According to regional reports, the Trump administration is reportedly nearing an economic deal with Cuba's leader, Miguel Díaz-Canel.
Wait, really? After years of the administration enforcing a policy of maximum economic pressure, they are negotiating a deal?
Yes. The reports suggest a potential loosening of specific travel and business restrictions in exchange for systemic, structural reforms within Cuba's government and economy.
That's a massive pivot.
If this holds true, it signals a massive strategic pivot. It suggests a shift from a policy of isolation to one of economic diplomacy. The underlying calculus might be that a completely collapsed, destabilized Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, suffering from total grid failure and mass migration, presents a far greater hemispheric security risk to the United States than a tentatively engaged one.
That is a fascinating recalibration of security priorities. And speaking of hemispheric security, U.S. President Donald Trump just hosted the Shield of the Americas Summit in Doral, Florida.
Right.
He brought together leaders and representatives from 17 Latin American and Caribbean nations to form a new multinational military coalition specifically aimed at combating drug cartels across the hemisphere.
And there's a real divide on how to handle that.
Reading the coverage of this summit, you see a sharp ideological divide on how to handle regional violence. The summit in Florida heavily highlighted and backed the right-leaning mano dura or iron fist approach.
The Bukele model.
Yes, this is the strategy championed by countries like El Salvador under Nayib Bukele, which relies on mass incarcerations, suspending certain civil liberties, and deploying overwhelming military force into the streets to crush gang violence and lower homicide rates. This U.S.-backed coalition seems to endorse that military-first strategy.
It is a policy that prioritizes the immediate suppression of cartel infrastructure through state force. It treats the drug trade as a violent insurgency that must be eradicated militarily.
Right. But conversely, you have the approach of Colombia's leftist president, Gustavo Petro. Now, Petro was notably excluded from this summit in Florida. He has heavily criticized this purely military approach.
He argues it's failed historically.
He argues that decades of the war on drugs have proven that military force alone is a failure. Instead, Petro argues that Colombia's current strategy is a much more effective long-term solution. Colombia is focusing on agricultural crop substitution programs. They have already converted 42,000 hectares of illegal coca farmland into legal, profitable crops for farmers, combined with highly targeted, intelligence-led confiscations of shipments.
It represents a fundamental disagreement on the root cause of the crisis.
How do you mean?
One side views the cartel violence as a military threat requiring suppression. The other side views the drug trade as a symptom of deep economic poverty and agricultural despair that must be unwound through development. You cannot arrest your way out of poverty, they argue. You have to provide a better economic alternative to growing coca.
And these ideological debates over security are never contained just to international summits. These global conflicts always bleed into domestic reality.
They absolutely do.
While these leaders were meeting in Florida to discuss multinational security, the FBI is currently investigating a tragic active shooter incident at Temple Israel in West Bloomfield, Michigan.
Yeah, that was horrific.
A suspect rammed a vehicle into the religious building and engaged in a firefight with security personnel. The authorities discovered the suspect had previous convictions tied to ISIS support, leading the FBI to investigate this terrifying incident as an act of terrorism.
It's awful.
It is a stark, brutal reminder of how international ideologies, religious extremism, and global instability physically manifest in local communities. The borders between foreign policy and domestic safety are incredibly porous.
They are non-existent. The rapid flow of digital information ensures that an ideological conflict in the Middle East can instantly radicalize an individual thousands of miles away.
It is a lot to process. The sheer weight of the news cycle can feel incredibly heavy. So to close this out, I want to take a deliberate step back from the immediate daily crises.
I think we need that.
Let's look at human behavior through a much wider historical lens. Because humanity has been dealing with disease, social stigma, and the desire for legacy for thousands of years. Discover magazine reported on a fascinating archaeological study regarding medieval Denmark.
Oh, the burial sites?
Yes, researchers were excavating burial sites from the Middle Ages, specifically looking at the remains of people who had contracted leprosy.
Leprosy, or Hansen's disease, was perhaps the most deeply feared and stigmatized disease in medieval Europe.
People were terrified of it.
Those afflicted were entirely cast out of society, forced to live in isolated colonies, and made to ring bells to warn others of their approach.
That is exactly what we have always been taught. But this new research found something startling. They discovered that wealthy individuals, members of the medieval elite who had contracted leprosy, were not cast out into mass graves.
Really?
They were still buried in highly prestigious central church plots surrounded by honors. What this proves is that social status, wealth, and power completely overrode the intense, supposedly rigid social and religious stigma of the disease. Even in the face of a terrifying plague, human hierarchy and the privileges of wealth remained the dominant rule of law. If you had money, the societal rules simply did not apply to you.
It is a profound observation about human nature. The structures of power insulate the elite from the realities suffered by the general population, regardless of the century.
And we're still actively trying to untangle the hierarchies and thefts of the past today. In modern restorative history, the BBC reported that the government of France has officially returned a sacred talking drum to the Ivory Coast.
That's a big deal.
This massive, intricately carved wooden artifact was looted by French colonial forces over a century ago. These drums were not just musical instruments. They were complex communication devices used to transmit messages across vast distances. For the people of the Ivory Coast, this drum holds deep spiritual and cultural significance.
When we tie this archaeological history together with the geopolitics of today, a very clear pattern emerges, which is, history shows us that the human drive to hoard resources, to establish hierarchies, and to secure a legacy, whether that is buying a prestigious graze in medieval Denmark or looting a sacred artifact during colonial conquest, persists across all eras.
It's all the same drive.
The return of the talking drum is a modern, tangible attempt to heal a historical geopolitical wound. It is an acknowledgement of past extraction, occurring at the exact same moment that modern nations are navigating the creation of entirely new wounds over lithium extraction and oil rights.
We are repeating the cycles, just with different technologies. Okay, let's take a breath and briefly recap the staggering journey we just went on together in this deep dive.
It was a long trip.
We started by looking up, with NASA's Artemis II gearing up to head back to the moon to test the heavy habitats required for Mars, while private billionaires raced to monopolize the orbital infrastructure.
Yeah.
We looked down at the hard biological limits of life on Earth, realizing that species cannot infinitely adapt to a cooking planet, even as we build AI systems that are so complex they defy our ability to test or control them.
The black boxes.
We navigated the fierce, immediate modern battles from Zimbabwe trying to control its lithium destiny to the economic shock waves of the Strait of Hormuz causing global inflation. And finally, we looked at the dirt, reading the historical artifacts of our past, from medieval graves showing the eternal power of wealth to repatriated drums seeking colonial justice.
It really demonstrates that the core human drives to explore the unknown, to consume energy, and to define our dominance in the universe remain an absolute constant, whether we are wielding a stone tool or a self-healing spacecraft.
It really does. Which brings me back to the very beginning of our deep dive. Earlier, we talked about how invisible cosmic rays strike a tiny grain of beach sand, turning it into a microscopic zircon crystal clock that traps krypton gas and records millions of years of Earth's history. So I want to leave you with a lingering question. When the archaeologists of the year 4000 dig down into the geological strata of the year 2026, what will our zircon crystals be?
That's a heavy thought.
Will they unearth the fossilized remains of a brilliant, self-healing spacecraft that finally carried humanity to the stars? Or will they simply find the irradiated echoes of an endless destructive fight over the last drops of oil in the Strait of Hormuz?
Wow.
Something for you to ponder as you look at the messy, interconnected puzzle pieces of the news today. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and truly understand the mechanics of the world with us. Stay curious, stay informed, and we will catch you next time.
You're enjoying Artificially Informed.
Hit subscribe and share it with a friend.
From the left, the right, and straight from the algorithm.
Thank you.
Welcome to the debate. So imagine holding the remote control to the entire global economy, right? You're flipping the channels of global trade with absolute confidence.
Yeah, the system we all know and rely on.
Exactly. But then you realize someone else just unplugged the television from the wall entirely.
Which is a pretty terrifying thought for the markets.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for decades, the Western financial system has basically mapped the arteries of planetary commerce. We know exactly where capital flows, where resources pulls, and, how this highly integrated global body sustains itself.
Right, down to the very last shipping container.
Precisely. But right at the center of that system, acting as this critical valve for the world's energy, is the Strait of Hormuz. And as of right now, because of the escalating conflict between the U.S., Israel, and Iran, that valve has been clamped completely shut.
Which is effectively a massive systemic shock to the planetary grid. I mean, we aren't just talking about a minor shipping delay here.
No, not at all.
The Strait of Hormuz is a maritime choke point responsible for roughly 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas supply. So with the Iranian government effectively leveraging control over this vital corridor, the economic ripples are hitting shores from Beijing to Bogota.
Yeah, every market on Earth is suddenly repricing the cost of basic survival.
Exactly.
And that brings us to the core geopolitical question we are exploring today. Does the current Hormuz blockade and the resulting global energy crisis signify a permanent structural shift toward a multipolar world order that actively undermines Western economic hegemony?
Or is this a severe but temporary market disruption that will ultimately reinforce the necessity of the traditional global economic system?
It is really the defining question of the decade.
Oh, without a doubt.
Right. And I hold the position that this crisis marks a permanent structural fracture in Western economic dominance. I mean, we are seeing it in real time, evidenced by the forced easing of U.S. sanctions and the successful proactive insulation of emerging powers like China.
While I argue that the global market panic and the frantic scramble to replace those disrupted oil supplies demonstrate that the world remains fundamentally tethered to the traditional interconnected capitalist energy paradigm.
All right, well, let's lay out the groundwork and look at the actual mechanics of global power here. For half a century, the West has relied on its financial architecture, specifically the sanctions regime and absolute control over dollar-denominated trade, to enforce its geopolitical will.
Right, the whole Washington consensus model.
Exactly. But the closure of Hormuz has essentially snapped that lever in half. I mean, we are looking at reporting from the Financial Times and the South China Morning Post, noting that U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was just forced to allow the sale of Russian oil at sea.
Well, but that's a reaction to...
Because global prices have soared well over $100 a barrel, right? The outcome of this is what matters structurally. It proves that a coordinated Russia-Iran access can effectively hijack the global economy.
I think hijack might be a strong word, but go on.
Well, UK Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper warned about this exact scenario during her visit to Saudi Arabia. They have forced the West to compromise its own sanctions regime.
I come at it from a completely different way, actually. I think the immediate and devastating reaction of global markets proves the exact opposite of decoupling.
How so?
Well, if the world were truly multipolar and economically compartmentalized, like if these emerging powers were actually insulated, a shock in the Middle East wouldn't trigger a synchronized global financial hemorrhage. Look at the data from the past few weeks. The Dow tumbled over 700 points to a 2026 low. We saw incredibly bearish sentiment completely sweep across Asia-Pacific trading floors.
Sure, panic is contagious.
But it's more than panic. No nation is immune to this shock because the world is entirely dependent on the existing interconnected system. The U.S. easing of Russian sanctions isn't a surrender. It's a tactical, calculated flex of financial control to manage inflation.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective on that flex. Let's actually unpack the plumbing of how those sanctions work, because I think it reveals the absolute limit of Western power.
Okay, let's hear it.
So the U.S. Treasury relies on the threat of secondary sanctions to keep Russian oil out of the global market. They essentially tell foreign banks and international shipping insurers, if you process a transaction for this oil, you lose access to the U.S. financial system.
Right, you lose access to clearing U.S. dollars. It's a massive financial weapon.
Exactly, a paper weapon. But because Iran blacked Hormuz, removing a fifth of the world's physical oil supply, the U.S. simply couldn't enforce that paper threat without causing massive domestic and global hyperinflation.
Because the world needs the oil.
Yes, economic sanctions are like a dam holding back water. A dam only works if you control the reservoir, but once an adversary like Iran applies physical pressure elsewhere, and you are forced to open your own financial floodgates just to survive, you prove to the world that your financial weapons have absolute limits.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Go ahead.
Opening the floodgates, to use your analogy, is precisely a demonstration of control over the dam. The U.S. retains the administrative and financial power to grant those waivers.
But they had no choice.
Maybe, but think about the sequence of events. The entire world, including the Russian shadow fleet and the major industrial buyers in Asia, was essentially holding its breath. They were waiting for Scott Bessent and the Treasury Department to give the green light before they dared to move that oil at sea, at volume.
Well,
If we were truly in a multipolar system, if they had truly decoupled, they wouldn't need a U.S. waiver. They wouldn't care what the U.S. Treasury said. They would have already circumvented the dollar entirely.
I hear you, but...
The fact that they waited for permission proves the U.S. financial system remains the ultimate arbiter of global trade.
But they are circumventing it, even if the waiver provides a convenient cover right now. And frankly, Russia is emerging as a massive beneficiary of this crisis.
In the short term, maybe.
As Al Jazeera highlighted recently, Russia is capitalizing on these soaring prices despite Western sanctions. Let's talk about that shadow fleet you mentioned.
The aging tankers.
Yeah, these are aging tankers, often operating completely without Western insurance, actively spoofing their GPS tracking to move oil under the radar. This Russia-Iran access isn't just profiting off temporary chaos. They are stress testing a new parallel system.
A parallel system that's incredibly inefficient.
Efficient or not, by forcing the U.S. to back down, they are proving a fundamental, almost philosophical economic reality. If you control the physical commodities, the actual oil, the gas, the minerals, you can out-leverage the nation that merely controls the fiat currency system.
That's a bold claim.
When push comes to shove, you cannot burn a U.S. Treasury bond to heat a home or power a factory.
That's a great soundbite, I'll give you that. But it assumes this axis is a cohesive geopolitical bloc with a shared, sustainable economic vision.
And you don't think it is?
It's not. These are two heavily sanctioned economies taking opportunistic advantage of a geopolitical flashpoint. Profiting from a supply shock doesn't equate to building a new world order.
They are building new infrastructure, though.
Yes, you can't burn a treasury bond, but you also cannot build a next-generation energy grid or secure long-term maritime trade without the global capital markets, which are still overwhelmingly dollar-denominated.
For now.
Once supply chains reroute and the pricing mechanism of the free market guarantees that they will, that temporary leverage completely evaporates.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you're assuming the rest of the world is just waiting passively for the supply chains to organically reroute. They aren't.
What do you mean?
Let's shift our focus to Asia, specifically China. If the U.S. is losing its absolute grip on the financial thermostat, who is catching the leverage? According to data from Inside Climate News, China saw this exact vulnerability coming years ago.
You're talking about their reserves.
Yes. They didn't just build a staggering 1.4 billion barrel strategic petroleum reserve to weather this type of storm. They fundamentally altered their domestic grid. In 2022, over half of the new cars sold in China were electric vehicles.
Right, the EV boom.
They have been installing more renewable infrastructure than the rest of the world combined. This means that while Western economies are panicking over $100 a barrel oil, the world's largest emerging power has effectively engineered a macroeconomic shock absorber.
Okay, that's a compelling argument.
This is how the global South and Eastern powers survive Western-centric supply shocks, by physically decoupling their baseline energy needs from the geopolitical choke points of the old world order.
I hear that, but have you considered the immediate physical realities on the ground in China right now? Because the data tells a much more complicated and, frankly, vulnerable story.
Vulnerable? With a 1.4 billion barrel reserve?
Yes, the EV numbers are impressive, but look at their power generation. Is China's current reliance on rapidly retrofitting coal plants a sign of multipolar strength?
Well,
Or does it prove that when push comes to shove, the quote-unquote clean energy transition is instantly sacrificed for traditional, dirty baseline power just to keep the lights on?
I would argue they are retrofitting coal as a highly flexible backup. It's a bridge mechanism to ensure sovereignty while they build out the renewables. It's a calculated security measure.
A bridge mechanism that highlights a massive, lingering vulnerability. You mentioned their 1.4 billion barrel crude stockpile. That's true for oil. But China does not have an equivalent, easily deployable stockpile for natural gas.
Liquid natural gas is tricky to store, sure.
It's heavily reliant on seaborne imports, and it is notoriously difficult to store in massive, multi-year quantities. Furthermore, we need to look beyond just energy. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just an oil corridor. It is a vital artery for global fertilizer supplies.
Right, agricultural inputs.
Exactly. China's food security, their ability to feed over 1 billion people, is directly tethered to the free flow of maritime trade through the Middle East. Beijing ordering domestic companies to hoard fertilizer reserves right now isn't a sign of strategic insulation. It's a sign of absolute panic.
I wouldn't call it panic. I'd call it preparation.
They aren't decoupled from the traditional global market. They are intimately tied to it, and they are just desperately trying to delay the economic pain that everyone else is already feeling.
But delaying the pain, managing the shock, that is exactly how a sovereign state protects its citizens while actively transitioning to a new paradigm.
By burning more coal?
By prioritizing domestic stability. You mentioned agriculture and the need for raw materials, which actually leads perfectly into how the broader global South is reacting. Because this isn't just a story about China or the Middle East.
Okay, where are we going?
If we take a truly planetary perspective, we are seeing a profound shift from mere adaptation to genuine economic fragmentation. Resource-rich nations across Latin America and Africa are looking at this Hormuz blockade and realizing they suddenly have unprecedented leverage.
Leverage to do what, exactly? Because history shows resource nationalism often backfires spectacularly.
Leverage to enforce true economic sovereignty, breaking away from what we used to call the Washington Consensus. Under the old model, the Global South exported raw dirt, unprocessed minerals to the West, and bought back incredibly expensive finished goods.
The standard industrialization curve, yeah?
But look at the recent Paris Nuclear Energy Summit. Brazil and China, alongside European nations, are pushing forward with pledges to triple global nuclear energy capacity by 2050.
Pledges are easy to make.
But they are actively architecting systems to bypass the volatile oil and gas markets you're describing. And look at Africa. Zimbabwe has outright banned the export of raw lithium.
Oh, I was hoping you'd bring up Zimbabwe.
They are telling the world, if you want the materials for your clean energy transition, you have to build the processing plants here. You have to provide domestic value addition. They are utilizing this era of multipolar tension to stop being mere extraction sites for Western economies.
In theory.
In practice, they are asserting themselves as sovereign industrial nodes in a brand new global economy.
I come at it from a different way, and I really have to push back strongly there. The political rhetoric of resource nationalism rarely aligns with the unforgiving mechanics of global industry.
How so?
Let's look at that exact Zimbabwe example. Citing analysts in climate change news, it is painfully clear that Zimbabwe's raw lithium export bans are highly precarious and, frankly, likely to fail.
Because of Western pressure.
Because of physical reality. You cannot mandate a domestic high-tech processing industry just by passing a law. To process lithium, you need massive, foundational investments in continuous baseload power and vast amounts of water.
Right, which they are trying to build.
But Zimbabwe's electrical grid is currently buckling under severe regional droughts and a lack of baseline power. If you ban raw exports without having the physical infrastructure to process those minerals domestically, you don't magically create a sovereign industrial node.
It forces the hand of investors, though.
No, you just kill your own primary revenue stream, bankrupt your mining sector, and heavily incentivize a black market.
Knowles certainly can see that the infrastructure gap is a massive hurdle for Harare. Absolutely. But the intent matters. The geopolitical posturing alone marks a clear, irreversible departure from the era of frictionless free trade dominated by Western capital.
But intent doesn't pay the bills. And if we look across the Atlantic to Latin America, the reaction to the Hormuz blockade proves my exact point about the immense resilience of the traditional market.
You're talking about the oil exports.
Yes, Guyana and Brazil aren't hoarding their oil to dismantle the global capitalist system. According to Latin America reports, they are currently benefiting massively from the crisis by redirecting their 4 million barrels a day to higher-paying Asian markets.
They're being opportunistic.
They are stepping in to fill the gap left by the Middle East. This is the exact opposite of fragmentation. When prices spike, emerging economies rush to participate in the traditional integrated fossil fuel market because that is where the capital is.
I see that, but
The pricing mechanism works. They aren't dismantling the unipolar economic system. They are eagerly pulling up a chair and taking a larger seat at its table.
that's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. I think you're looking at short-term commodity trading and mistaking it for long-term strategic alignment.
How is selling oil not strategic alignment?
Yes, Brazil is perfectly happy to sell oil to Asia at a premium today. But simultaneously, as we noted, they are signing nuclear pacts, they are pursuing bilateral trade agreements that bypass the US dollar entirely, settling trades in local currencies.
Hedging their bets.
They are playing the short game, maximizing oil profits, specifically to fund the long game of structural independence, the US interventions, the weaponization of sanctions, the glaring vulnerability of relying on a single maritime strait in the Middle East. All of this is accelerating a planetary realization that reliance on a single hegemon is a massive national security threat.
It's certainly a risk assessment moment for every sovereign nation. I'll completely agree with you there. Every capital city is looking at their vulnerabilities.
Exactly.
But the conclusion they are drawing isn't that they can survive an isolated, regional blocks or a fractured multipolar system. The conclusion is that they need more integration.
More integration?
Yes. They need more diverse supply chains, more redundant trade routes, but still fundamentally operating within the capitalist framework of global trade.
The market's pricing mechanisms, the sheer fact that a naval maneuver in Hormuz immediately raises the price of Brazilian crude, which then affects the cost of agricultural transport, which eventually dictates the cost of a taxi ride in Lima, shows how inextricably linked our planetary economy truly is.
It shows vulnerability.
You can't decouple from a circulatory system without cutting off your own oxygen.
Well, we have covered immense ground today, tracing the economic shockwaves of the Strait of Hormuz blockade across the globe.
We certainly have.
To summarize my position, the fact that the United States was forced to publicly ease its sanctions regime on Russia, combined with the Global South's proactive resource strategies, from China's massive strategic oil reserves to Zimbabwe's lithium export bans and Brazil's long-term nuclear pacts, demonstrates a permanent restructuring.
Right.
The global economy is decisively moving away from Western financial unipolarity and establishing a resilient, multipolar architecture.
And to summarize my perspective, the immediate severe global market panic and the structural vulnerabilities exposed in even the most prepared nations like China, particularly regarding seaborne natural gas and agricultural fertilizer, prove otherwise. The fact that the world immediately scrambled for alternative oil players like Guyana and Brazil, and that markets repriced commodities instantly shows that the planet remains inextricably linked to the traditional integrated global market. This is an incredibly severe disruption, yes, but its very severity reinforces our absolute reliance on a unified economic system rather than dismantling it.
Despite our different lenses, I think we have found a critical point of convergence today.
I think so too.
We both agree that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the stark reality of oil sitting well above $100 a barrel acts as a massive accelerant. It is forcing profound, rapid shifts in global supply chains, compelling literally every continent to fundamentally re-evaluate its energy security, its infrastructure, and its geopolitical alliances.
Absolutely. The era of taking global supply lines and frictionless maritime trade for granted is decisively over. Efficiency is being replaced by security.
And it highlights the immense value of viewing these crises not just through a localized or strictly Western lens, but from a truly planetary perspective. To understand the geopolitical reality today, you have to see how a single military maneuver in the Strait of Hormuz, instantly ripples through the financial plumbing of the global economy, affecting markets from Beijing to Bogota.
Exactly.
The long-term economic fallout contained in the source material provides rich, complex ground for future exploration as the situation continues to unfold. So as we look at the clamped valve in the Middle East, we are left to wonder, will the global economy's arteries permanently reroute themselves to survive, or will the immense pressure eventually force the old pathways back open? Thank you for joining us.
That's it for today's Artificially Informed.
Nope. Thanks for spending your time with us.
Yeah.
Stay sharp, stay curious. See you next time.